The Soviet Union, officially known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was one of the most influential geopolitical entities of the 20th century. From its revolutionary birth in 1922 to its sudden collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union was a superpower that reshaped global politics, economics, society, and culture. To understand the history of the Soviet Union is to grasp a story of ideological battles, economic experiments, military struggles, and the enduring human desire for equality, justice, and progress. The roots of revolution. The roots of the Soviet Union's rise trace back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time of tremendous social and economic upheaval in Russia. Tsarist Russia was vast, stretching from Europe to the Pacific, but it was also a deeply stratified society, with immense wealth concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The majority of the population were peasants living in dire conditions, burdened by poverty, lack of political rights, and feudal obligations. The rapid industrialization of the late 19th century brought an influx of workers to the cities, creating an urban proletariat that began to agitate for political reforms and workers' rights. Simultaneously, Marxist ideas, rooted in the belief that class struggle was the engine of history, began to take hold among intellectuals and revolutionaries. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had predicted that capitalism would ultimately collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, and in its place would arise a classless, stateless society based on communal ownership of the means of production. In Russia, a group of Marxists led by Vladimir Lenin became convinced that their country, despite being less industrialized than its Western counterparts, was ripe for revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. World War I proved to be the catalyst for the Russian Revolution. The war drained Russia's resources and led to widespread famine, economic dislocation, and military defeat. The Tsarist regime's inability to manage the war effort, combined with growing public discontent, led to the February Revolution of 1917, in which Tsar Nicholas II abdicated and a provisional government was established. However, the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, failed to address the most pressing issues: land reform, food shortages, and Russia's continued participation in the war. Lenin, who had been in exile, returned to Russia in April 1917 and called for peace, land, and bread, a slogan that resonated with the war-weary soldiers, peasants, and workers. By October, Lenin's Bolshevik Party had garnered enough support to stage a second revolution. On October 25, 1917, Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd, and the provisional government was overthrown. The Bolsheviks, later known as the Communist Party, immediately set about dismantling the old order. Private property was abolished, factories were placed under worker control, and the land was redistributed to the peasants. But the new regime faced fierce opposition, both domestically and internationally, leading to a brutal civil war that lasted until 1922. During this period, the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, battled the White Army, which was composed of monarchists, capitalists, and foreign interventionist forces from the Allied powers. The birth of the Soviet Union. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was formally established. The new state was composed of Russia and several other republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasian territories. The USSR was the world's first socialist state, and its leaders believed they were at the vanguard of a global proletarian revolution. The Communist Party, led by Lenin, sought to build a new society based on Marxist principles, which required the complete transformation of political, economic, and social structures. However, the early years of the Soviet Union were fraught with difficulties. The Civil War had devastated the economy, and a severe famine in 1921 to 1922 claimed the lives of millions. In response to these crises, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921, a temporary retreat from socialist principles that allowed for a mixed economy in which small-scale private enterprise was permitted. The NEP succeeded in stabilizing the economy, but it also created tensions within the Communist Party, with some members believing it was a betrayal of Marxism. Lenin's death in 1924 set off a power struggle within the Communist Party, with Joseph Stalin ultimately emerging as the victor. Stalin's rise to power marked a significant turning point in Soviet history, as he sought to consolidate his authority and radically transform the Soviet state. Stalin's reign, industrialization and terror. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union embarked on a massive campaign of industrialization and collectivization. Stalin believed that the USSR needed to rapidly modernize its economy to catch up with the West and defend itself against potential threats. Beginning in 1928, the Soviet government launched the first of several five-year plans, which set ambitious targets for the development of heavy industry, such as steel, coal, and machinery. The state took control of all means of production, and private enterprise was abolished. Simultaneously, Stalin sought to collectivize agriculture, forcing millions of peasants to give up their land and join collective farms. This policy met with widespread resistance, particularly among the wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, who were branded enemies of the state. The forced collectivization of agriculture led to a catastrophic famine in 1932 to 1933, particularly in Ukraine, where millions of people died, a tragedy known as the Holodomor. Stalin's regime was characterized by extreme repression. The late 1930s saw the height of the Great Purge, during which Stalin targeted perceived enemies within the Communist Party, the military, and broader society. Thousands of people were executed or sent to labor camps, gulags, on trumped-up charges of treason, espionage, and counter-revolutionary activity. Stalin's rule instilled fear in the population, but it also succeeded in transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial power. World War II and the Soviet victory. World War II was a defining moment for the Soviet Union. In 1939, the USSR signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which included secret provisions for the division of Eastern Europe. However, in June 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The initial stages of the war were disastrous for the Soviets, as the German army advanced rapidly into Soviet territory, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians. But the Soviet Union managed to turn the tide of the war, thanks in part to the harsh Russian winter, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the strategic leadership of generals like Georgy Zhukov. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, marked a turning point in the war. After months of brutal urban warfare, the Red Army encircled and defeated the German Sixth Army, marking the beginning of the Soviet pushback. By 1945, the Soviet Union had not only liberated its own territory but also advanced into Eastern Europe, eventually capturing Berlin in May of that year. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a superpower, having played a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. However, the war had come at an enormous cost. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, both soldiers and civilians, had died, and much of the country lay in ruins. The post-war period would be defined by the challenge of rebuilding, as well as the onset of a new global conflict, the Cold War. The Cold War and the Soviet bloc. The end of World War II saw the division of Europe into two spheres of influence, the Western Bloc, led by the United States and its allies, and the Eastern Bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union. The Cold War, a period of intense geopolitical rivalry between the US and the USSR, would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades. In Eastern Europe, Stalin established a series of satellite states, including Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, all of which were governed by communist regimes loyal to Moscow. The Soviet Union sought to protect itself from potential Western aggression by creating a buffer zone of friendly states. However, the imposition of communist rule in these countries was often met with resistance, leading to uprisings, such as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968, both of which were brutally suppressed by Soviet forces. The Cold War was marked by an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, particularly in the realm of nuclear weapons. Both superpowers sought to develop and maintain a nuclear arsenal capable of deterring the other, leading to a doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, but it also led to a temporary thaw in relations, as both sides realized the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear conflict. While the Soviet Union maintained a powerful military, its economy began to stagnate in the 1970s. The state's focus on heavy industry and defense spending came at the expense of consumer goods and services, leading to widespread shortages and declining living standards. Additionally, the Soviet political system, characterized by bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption, became increasingly rigid and resistant to reform. The era of reform, Gorbachev and the collapse of the USSR. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that the Soviet Union needed reform. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, sought to revitalize the Soviet system through a series of reforms known as perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. These policies aimed to address the inefficiencies of the Soviet economy and government by introducing elements of market economics, reducing the central control over production, and promoting greater transparency and freedom of speech within the Soviet political system. Gorbachev believed that reforming the Soviet Union was necessary to make it more adaptable to modern challenges while preserving its socialist principles. Perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika represented Gorbachev's attempt to decentralize economic planning and allow for limited private enterprise. It encouraged local managers to make decisions about production based on market demands rather than the dictates of central planners. The state loosened its grip on some sectors of the economy, particularly in agriculture and small-scale consumer industries. However, Perestroika was only partially successful, as many of the reforms were implemented too slowly or were met with resistance by entrenched members of the Communist Party bureaucracy, who feared losing their privileges and power. Glasnost was perhaps the more revolutionary of Gorbachev's policies. It sought to increase openness in government and the media, allowing for greater public discussion and criticism of political leaders and policies. Censorship was relaxed, leading to a surge in investigative journalism and the publication of previously banned books, articles, and films. Glasnost also allowed for the airing of deep-seated grievances, including criticism of the Soviet Union's past abuses, such as the purges under Stalin, the repressions in Eastern Europe, and the mismanagement that had led to decades of economic hardship. While Glasnost gave Soviet citizens a new sense of freedom and empowerment, it also unleashed forces that Gorbachev struggled to control. As people began to speak out, long-suppressed nationalist and separatist movements in the republics that made up the Soviet Union gained momentum. In places like the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, there were increasing calls for independence. Ethnic tensions also flared in regions like Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenians and Azerbaijanis clashed over territorial claims. The fall of the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet system had become apparent to both the leadership and the population. Economic stagnation persisted despite Gorbachev's reforms, and dissatisfaction with the government grew. In addition to internal challenges, the Soviet Union was facing mounting pressure from the West, particularly under U.S. President Ronald Reagan, whose administration had embarked on a military buildup intended to outpace Soviet capabilities, further straining the USSR's economy. In Eastern Europe, Gorbachev's policies of non-intervention in the affairs of Soviet bloc states, the so-called Sinatra Doctrine, encouraged anti-communist movements. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept through Eastern Europe, leading to the fall of communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, and Romania. The most symbolic moment came with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, signaling the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Back in the USSR, the tide of nationalist movements continued to rise. In 1990, Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to declare independence, with others soon following suit. Gorbachev attempted to hold the Union together through negotiation and constitutional reform, proposing a new Union treaty that would grant more autonomy to the republics while keeping them within a loose federation. However, hardline communists, alarmed by the growing disintegration of Soviet power, attempted a coup in August 1991 to oust Gorbachev and restore strict central control. The coup failed, largely due to the efforts of Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, who rallied popular support against the plotters. However, the failed coup accelerated the unraveling of the Soviet Union. In the aftermath, Yeltsin and the leaders of several other republics moved to declare their independence from the Soviet Union. In December 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president, and the USSR was officially dissolved, ending 69 years of Soviet rule. Legacy of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in global geopolitics. For many, the disintegration of the USSR was a triumph of democracy and free markets over authoritarianism and central planning. However, the transition from Soviet socialism to capitalism in the post-Soviet states, particularly in Russia, was tumultuous. The 1990s were marked by economic collapse, rampant inflation, and a sharp decline in living standards for many people. The privatization of state assets led to the rise of a class of oligarchs, while the social safety net that had existed under Soviet rule was largely dismantled. Despite the Soviet Union's many failures, its repression of political dissent, its economic inefficiencies, and its often brutal authoritarianism, it also left behind a complex legacy. The USSR had played a pivotal role in the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, and its achievements in science, technology, and education were remarkable. The Soviet Union was the first country to send a human being into space, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, and it maintained an extensive system of public education and healthcare that provided basic services to millions of people. The Soviet Union also served as a model and inspiration for revolutionary movements around the world, particularly in developing countries. During the Cold War, the USSR supported anti-colonial and socialist movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, contributing to the global spread of Marxist and socialist ideas. In the realm of culture, the Soviet Union produced some of the 20th century's most important literature, film, and art. Writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, and later, Soviet authors like Mikhail Bulgakov, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Anna Akhmatova offered critical insights into Russian and Soviet society. Soviet filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein and Andrei Tarkovsky created works that pushed the boundaries of cinematic art, while composers like Dmitry Shostakovich and Sergei Prokofiev left a lasting legacy in classical music. The collapse of the Soviet Union left a profound impact on the world and reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The end of the USSR meant the emergence of 15 independent countries, each facing its own set of challenges in the post-Soviet period. Russia, as the largest and most powerful of the former Soviet republics, inherited much of the USSR's military and diplomatic apparatus, but it also faced the difficult task of defining its identity in the post-Soviet world. Under the leadership of figures like Boris Yeltsin and, later, Vladimir Putin, Russia sought to reassert itself as a global power, often looking back to its Soviet past as a source of strength and continuity. For many people, both within the former Soviet Union and around the world, the memory of the USSR remains a subject of debate and reflection. Some view the Soviet era with nostalgia, remembering the stability and sense of purpose it provided, while others see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarianism and central planning. The Soviet Union's impact on world history is undeniable, and its legacy continues to shape the political, economic, and cultural dynamics of the 21st century.